Thanks for the introduction, and actually thanks to you for having me here once again. So hopefully you will never get bored of me. Something like that. Yeah, as Daniel was saying, this is basically going to be the target of my presentation. So I'm not going to analyze all the classical problems and issues that VoIP systems, WebRTC systems typically have to endure, because Sandro and others have done an excellent job at addressing those and finding more issues, how to solve them, finding problems, and so on. What I'm trying to do with this presentation is explaining how WebRTC tried to, let's say, take those features, those properties into account when designing the infrastructure in the first place. So how they tried to make the technology robust to all of those attacks by design. So whether or not they succeeded and whether or not there are things that need to be done, we'll discuss those at the end of the presentation, but basically that's the main aim of the presentation. And so a few words about me before we start. So all you need to know about me is that I'm basically become a human couch in the last year. So we have 3 cats at home. I always hated cats for the first 40 years of my life, and I ended up with 3 cats at home, which means that I'm really close to becoming something like this. I mean, the long hair are already there, but so. But I'll try not to become this kind of person. So. And in general, I got my PhD at the University of Napoli, and there is also where I met all of the colleagues with whom I actually co-founded Meetecho, which was born as an academic spin-off at the University of Napoli. The university is not part of the company. We just have a brand that says that the research effort that we did there actually ended up as a product in Meetecho. And I'm actually the chairman there, because they promised a nice chair that actually never appeared. I believe a lot in open source, of course, and if you want to learn more about what we do, because we are basically a consulting company, we also do streaming of events and stuff like this, you can just visit our website and you can see what we offer there. And there's also my Twitter account there and a list of some of the slides that I presented in the past at these and other events. So as Daniel was saying, I'm not going to talk about Janus, but since I'm shameless, I've managed to squeeze it in at the very end of the presentation anyway, just for a few related aspects. And of course, I mean, before delving into the content of the presentation itself, as I've said, we all know about all of the challenges that VoIP systems have had to endure and how hard it is to take care of them all. New attacks happen every day and so on. For instance, RTP Bleed, I'm going to mention these in a few slides anyway. And typically, the first step that you usually are encouraged to take anyway, even though, as Ole said, TLS doesn't mean security. There is much more to that than this. But in principle, as long as you make your signaling channel secure, you're still doing a step in the right direction, which is what you should always do. Which is harder for media, of course, because signaling is one thing and media is another. And we all know that securing RTP, at least historically, was not as easy as securing SIP, for instance, because for SIP, you could just say, let's put TLS over it, let's add identity mechanisms and stuff like that. We could not use TLS for RTP because RTP typically travels through UDP. And IPsec was not a viable option either, especially because you wanted this to be as widespread as possible and easy to deploy and basically available everywhere. So I'm not spoiling anything by saying that, of course, this solution exists. The ITF worked on this a long time ago, where they basically extended RTP to make it secure and add some properties there. So it's basically an extension because nothing changes in an RTP packet itself. You just add some things to it. You keep the header in the clear. You encrypt the payload of the media so that if somebody captures an RTP packet, they cannot just listen to what was in there if it was a voice packet. For instance, you encrypt these, and then you hash the whole packet so that nobody can touch that packet anymore once it has been sent in the wild. And this part is in the clear because there are components in the middle that may need to be aware of the header information like SSRC, payload type, and so on to make decisions based on whatever is in there. And of course, encrypting the packet is one thing. You also need a way to exchange keys, to allow 2 people into a conversation to exchange keys with each other in order to decide how they're actually going to communicate in a secure way. And as you may know, there have been several different proposals, and I'll briefly go through them all just to declare who was the winner at the very end. There were several alternatives. I mean, Mickey was one of them, even though, as far as I know, it's still being used by 3GPP, but it's actually way too complex. It never got deployed much into regular VoIP deployments, so you can pretty much forget about it now. There's ZRTP, which was written by Zimmerman, who you may know because he was the author of PGP. So if you're using PGP, he's actually the same author of that, who actually had a better idea to handle this exchange of keys in a secure way in VoIP calls, which was basically by focusing on the end-to-end exchange of this information. And basically, it happens via a Diffie-Hellman exchange on the media path, which means that you have the usual SIP handshake to establish a call, and there is nothing there except maybe an attribute to say, I'm going to use ZRTP to do the media. And then before you actually start exchanging media, you actually exchange ZRTP packets to establish a Diffie-Hellman session and exchange the keys in a secure way end-to-end, basically, between the two callers. So the SIP server is not part of that. No other component is part of that. It's just the end-to-end way of exchanging these keys. And typically, this works by pre-exchanging the keys in advance, the certificates in advance, like you do with PGP and stuff like this. So you typically do not even need a public key infrastructure for this to work. But this is very effective as a secure mechanism to work. That said, what really got widespread development in VoIP systems, as you may know, is SDS instead, which stands for Secure Description. And actually, the secure part in there, as we'll see, is not as secure as it was originally meant. And the idea there was that basically you would exchange the keys in the SDP. So not end-to-end, but you would exchange those keys in the SDP as part of the offer-answer process. So you would say, I will do audio, and this is the key that I will use to secure it, and the other part will do the same, basically. While instead, at the end, you had DTLS SRTP, which DTLS is basically like TLS for UDP, and they added an extension to actually exchange SRTP information as part of an handshake like TLS. I'll add some more details later to this to give you a clearer idea, but these were basically the several different alternatives, and these were also discussed in a hot debate at the ITF more than 10 years ago now. So you can see here some details about how they ended up and who was the winner at the end in terms of, for the ITF at least. So who the ITF decided was the best choice, even though you should already know it, actually. And so just a few quick words on SDS in principle. I was saying that it was not really secure, and of course it is implicit by the fact that you're actually exchanging keys in the SDP, which is insecure by default, especially if the communication channel is not secure by itself. And it's really easy to implement because you just need to add a new attribute to the SDP where you say, this is a crypto information, this is the suit that I'm going to use for the security properties of SRTP, and these are my master key and sold in line as a base 64 encoded string. Which means that unlike ZRTP, for instance, as we see later, DTLS SRTP, there is no end-to-end exchange. All the exchanges in the key happen before the communication takes place. And so as soon as you start exchanging packets, you are exchanging SRTP packets, secure packets, because you have exchanged this information already. Which, of course, is fine and is easy to implement and so on, but only as long as you can trust all of the components in the middle, because any component that has access to your SDP has access to your communication. So this may be a trusted component, this may not be a trusted component. You cannot know in advance, and this is something that is worrisome to the very least. Which leads us to DTLS SRTP, which unsurprisingly was the winner of that whole debate that I was mentioning before, which wasn't really very much deployed up to very recently, and I'll explain later why. And in DTLS, the concept is similar to ZRTP. So you do a handshake before actually exchanging media packets end-to-end between the two different users, with the exception that you don't do it via Diffie-Hellman like you do with ZRTP and so on, but you use, as I was saying, DTLS. So you do an handshake between the two. One of the two acts as a client, one of the two acts as a server. They cryptographically exchange certificate information, pretty much as you would do with HTTP over TLS and stuff like this. And as part of this exchange, you are also going to exchange the SRTP keys that you are going to use. And so you're still going to add some information to the SDP, but unlike SDS, it's not going to be the keys themselves. It's just going to be a fingerprint of the certificate that you are going to exchange as part of this exchange over here, which means that when you actually do the communication with the other peer to exchange these keys and information and so on, if you find out that in this exchange, in the DTLS exchange, the certificate that you received does not have a fingerprint that corresponds to the one that you got into the SDP, then you know that this is not the guy that you thought you were talking to. It means that somebody else knew that you were listening on that port, tried to establish a DTLS session with you, and you know that from that exchange that this is not the right guy. So this is not the person that you were supposed to talk to, which means that it is a good thing. So at least now we have something better than SDS. We don't exchange keys in the SDP, but end-to-end instead. Which brings us, after about 9 minutes, so I was fast enough, I hope, to WebRTC itself. So as you may know, this WebRTC was a joint standardization effort by the ITF and the W3C to bring real-time communications integrated in browsers themselves. So with no plugins needed, so just browsers and a bit of JavaScript to drive it. And as you may know, it reuses a lot of pre-existing standards, even though on steroids, we might say. So if you look at an SDP from WebRTC and you're used to the SDP used in SIP, you are probably going to tear the hair out of your head because it's really crazy. There's a lot of stuff in it. And most importantly, it has a lot of additional security information properties added to those protocols that you may already be using, like SDP, SRTP, ICE, and a few others. It's important to point out that SIP and other signaling protocols are not part of the WebRTC specification by default. They left it out by design. So no matter what kind of signaling you are going to use, it's all up to you, and you just need to use SDP as a way to exchange the negotiation information, that's all. Of course, there was a strong emphasis on security and privacy, and there are a couple of drafts that are really important for this. I'll go briefly over that in a few slides. And very importantly, the media security is mandatory, and they mandate SRTP and they mandate DTLS SRTP with additional cryptographic information. They say that you have to use elliptic curves and stuff like this. And they specifically say that you must not implement SDS because it sucks too much in terms of security. So it's really not that good. And you may remember that Chrome in the past implemented SDS and they had to remove it because it was not acceptable anymore. And of course, since, as we said at the beginning, signaling, as long as the really important part is that you encrypt signaling as well, HTTPS is mandatory as well for WebRTC. So if you visit a website that is not using HTTPS, WebRTC will never work. The browsers will prevent that. And of course, you've probably all seen these kind of slides for a long time. I mean, WebRTC kind of looks like SIP in terms of the SIP trapezoid and stuff like this, with the difference that, of course, you have the most powerful soft phone ever in here because it's just JavaScript. You can put whatever you want in there. It's actually even more flexible than it should. Sometimes it's even scarier because you can actually change the soft phone way too much beyond what you plan to do at the beginning. Of course, it's not exactly SIP because, as I said, there's no SIP at all in the signaling, even though you may want to use it, and many still do, for signaling, even in WebRTC purposes. But apart from this, the WebRTC specification is really crazy with a lot of different stuff that goes from negotiation to connection establishment, video transport, and so on. With a strong emphasis on security and stuff like this, which is reflected in these slides that typically is also present in many WebRTC-related presentations. So the different ways, and most importantly, the strong focus on security that both signaling and media delivery have to have. So about WebRTC, the WebRTC architecture, the main concept that the drafts try to convey is that basically the trusted component base, so the only person that you can really trust is yourself. So, and of course, I mean the browser in this case. Then, of course, you can kind of trust the web server if HTTPS is verified and things like this. So that you may go to drevil.com, even if it's on HTTPS, you probably don't really trust that. And other users, if you can verify them too, as I'll show later. And typically, there are different steps that a WebRTC endpoint does whenever a call is to be established. So first of all, they explicitly ask you if you want to give access to your devices. So do you really want to use this webcam and this microphone to establish a communication? So they need to ask because otherwise people could just access your microphone when you are in your underwear and it's bad news, basically. And this only affects user interfaces, of course. There's no real protocol involved in this. But then it's very important that there is media consent verification as well, and this is done by ICE. So ICE is, of course, used to do NAT traversal and make sure that you can find the communication path, so a way for two users to communicate with each other for establishing a conversation. But this information is also authenticated because as part of the SDP exchange, you also exchange ICE credentials and a password and so on, which means that the the connectivity checks that you exchange each other are actually verified as well. So they are, this way, nobody can, let's say, interfere with that path and, let's say, send you stun requests and try to drive the communication to them instead. This basically is an additional step in making things a bit more secure. We already went through how the DTLS RTP helps you make the communication setup itself secure by exchanging the keys end-to-end. Eventually, you use SRTP as a way to encrypt the packets themselves using the keys that you exchange via DTLS. And after that, there still is a mechanism called content freshness. So you still keep on exchanging connectivity checks, even if the connection is alive, with the other party, just to see that your peer, the guy that you're talking to, is still there and maybe has not fallen because his connectivity fell out and so on. And you can read some more information in the draft itself. I mean, this is really a very quick overview on the process that it takes from a very high-level perspective, even though it gives you a better idea of how it all works. And you may be wondering, I mentioned before RTP Bleed, and you may be wondering if WebRTC is affected as well. Of course, if you don't know what RTP Bleed is, I encourage you to go on their website there. I think Sandro did a very good job at explaining all of this, and I also saw a presentation from another guy at FOSDEM where they actually explained this in more detail. And the problem there is basically that there are several servers that do some kind of a media latching. So in order to do NAT traversal without using ICE, you just sit on a public interface, and instead of sending media to the port and address that were negotiated because the other guy may be behind a firewall, you just send media back to whoever contacted you on the port that was negotiated for that session. Which, I mean, is a simple and easy trick to avoid using ICE, but it's of course terrible for security because it means that whoever knows the port that you're using can just interfere with the communication and steal that session from you. So it may not be able to watch the conversation or to actually inject media because, I don't know, maybe SRTP is involved. So the communication is still secure, but you are not going to receive that media anymore because somebody else did instead, which is, of course, very bad news. And, of course, the good news instead is that WebRTC is typically not affected because ICE and, of course, SRTP itself help typically avoid this. And I mean typically here because, of course, we are talking about software. So there may be software that actually implement things different ways and so on. And so even by using ICE, there may be components that still do some kind of a media latching anyway for some reason. So you still need to be careful. I mean, WebRTC as a technology is supposed not to be affected about this. Of course, you need to make sure that it is implemented the right way. And you may also be wondering about man-in-the-middle attacks, which is also another common problem. So we've seen briefly how you can exchange the cryptographic information between two different browsers via SDP. Eventually, they do a DTLS handshakes. They verify that the fingerprints match. It's all nice. I mean, everything works fine. The problem is that, of course, there may be a component in the middle, and this may or may not be a back-to-back user agent. I mean, you've seen this slide thousands of times in the context of back-to-back user agents where you have such a component acting as a media bridge between two different components. The problem with WebRTC is that this doesn't even need to be a server. This may be another browser because it's really easy, and you can see some more information in this blog post here, to actually write a JavaScript application that creates two different peer connections with two different people, and then takes the media from one connection and sends it to the other and vice versa. So that this is me. This is James. We are actually seeing each other because he's sending my video to James and vice versa, but actually we are not talking directly, we are talking via a component in the middle. We have a person in the middle who is actually able to watch us talk to each other, because in that case, this is two different cryptographic sessions, and the media here is unencrypted. This is terminated. These are two different hop by hops. And from a signaling and perspective and so on, this is all correct, because I see this fingerprint and this person sees this fingerprint. So these are two legitimate hop by hop connections and so on, with the problem that these guys should not be here, basically. And how can you solve this problem? I mean, and this is a bit of a problem because basically something that I didn't say yet is that in WebRTC, all of the certificates that you use to exchange, to do the DTLS handshake and so on, are typically always self-signed and also typically recreated for every peer connection that you create. which means that you cannot do any real validation on the certificates. It's something that I created on the fly just to do a communication. You just validate that my certificate is the one that I'm using by looking at the fingerprint, but it's done. I mean, there is no actual verification for that. And the ITF is working on a new concept called identity providers. I mean, new concept because it is something that is actually used in other contexts as well, but here it's applied to the WebRTC environments. And typically the idea is that you use these identity providers as a way to let's say, add some identity to your session. So the typical scenario is that the peer connection generates a fingerprint and you use a certificate as you've done so far normally. Then you send these, you collect these certificate and fingerprint information and you pass them to an identity provider that you trust, that may be a know-out server, it could be by Google, by Facebook, by wherever you want. They basically say, they basically associate this bit of information to your public identity, like your OAuth identity and so on, and they give you back a so-called identity assertion. You put this identity assertion in the SDP, the same does the guy on the other hand, you exchange this information, so you not only check the fingerprints now, but as soon as you started receiving, as soon as you're both aware of each other's SDP's information, you also validate that the information that you received, so the fingerprints that you're exchanging, are actually those that belong to you or not. So I will call this other guy's identity provider to say, look, I just received this fingerprint. Is this fingerprint actually belonging to this guy or not? And the same will do the other guy with me, and ideally this should work. And if this sounds a bit confusing, it's because it actually is. It's still in definition and so on. And just to give you an idea, the client-side implementation of all this is only available in Firefox right now. Chrome hasn't touched it, Safari hasn't either, and so on. And they're closely following the specification, of course. And up to a few weeks ago, there wasn't even a server, an identity provider service to test this with, which is something that was actually done at the latest ITF in London. So as you may know, at the ITF meeting, there is always a hackathon sessions where people go there and work together on some aspects and stuff like this. And a few of them actually gather to work on exactly on an identity service to start playing with this in a practical way. And in fact, you can find some more information on that blog post over here if you want to start experimenting with it, which also includes references to some actual implementations that you can play on GitHub and stuff like this. And this is basically how it all works. So you collect information about your fingerprints. Eventually, you get an identity assertion back. This is encoded in base 264, and you put it in the SDP and shoot it on the other side. Daniel, of course, was also mentioning privacy before, which is also a huge issue. And you may have heard this several times. So the fact that, for instance, a website was using, or maybe advertisers were using fake data channels to basically steal information like where you are and stuff like this, which can happen because of how ICE works. So as soon as you start creating a WebRTC peer connection, you start collecting IPs that you send on the other end, and these IPs may include your public and private addresses and so on. And if this doesn't turn up into an actual session establishment because you're actually just using to steal information, this is, of course, a problem. So to try and cope with this, the ITF has also started working on a new document that basically mandates different modes of behavior for WebRTC. So, and these different modes are, let's say, one more strict than the other. So in mode one, you just gather all the addresses that you have from all of the interfaces to say, let's try and find the best path possible for communicating with each other. The second one is a bit more strict, by which you say, okay, let's not use just all of the addresses, but let's just look at the default route in the kernel. Let's see which local interface this is associated with, and let's just gather addresses for this interface instead. So we are not looking at these other 2 or 3 interfaces that you may have. We are just using those, which typically will work in the context wherever HTTP works to connect to an external website will work as well. There is another one where you just use the default route and you don't even gather the local candidate addresses, but just the public addresses, which is, I mean, a bit more problematic if you want to communicate internally in a LAN, because it means that you have to get out, even though you could throw directly within a LAN. And eventually, there's also the stricter of them all, which always forces the usage of a proxy, which of course means that you cannot use, if you cannot use a DP, the quality is going to be very much problematic. And typically there has been some debate on when to choose between these two, because of course, ideally from a service, you would want to be able to use this one, the one that tries to use all of the available interfaces and so on, especially if, for instance, the service that you want to use is one that is not on the interface that you use to get on the public internet outside, but maybe it's a private interface that you use to communicate to the local device in your house, for instance. And the problem is here that the draft specifically says that you can only use mode 1 if there has been a user consent, which raises the question, what is user consent in this case? Because how do we ask people which mode they are, let's say, more favorable with? And let's say the suggestion that they came up with, which I'm not really happy about, is that they are basically saying, yeah, I hear Tim laughing about this, I guess he's not too. And but they basically say, let's use the get user media, so the consent for access to your local devices, as a way to signify consent to use mode 1 as well, which is really a terrible idea, because I mean, of course it's useful in one-to-one communications, calls, conferences, and so on, but if you're just watching a broadcast like this one, for instance, I'm going on the PASCOM website to watch the Kamailio streaming, maybe it's done with WebRTC, I'm never going to give access to my webcam just to watch something and so on, or maybe I'm just using data channels to communicate with an IoT device in the backend and so on. There would be no need to actually give this service access to my devices, so I would probably deny this access, which means that I'm going to use a suboptimal way of gathering information, which might even result in not being able to communicate at all. I mean, this is a big issue. I mean, this draft is closing in to become an RFC and so on, but the discussion is still raging on. And very quickly on the last slide, because I'm running out of time. One last interesting point is some, let's say, future steps in terms of WebRTC, because, and this is related also to the point where we've seen before about the man-in-the-middle attacks, about the component in the middle that may hide the end-to-end cryptographic information, which is, of course, an issue where the guy is evil, but may not be really an issue when you're actually using a conference server, for instance. Let's say that you are using Jitsi or Janus or MediaSoup or whatever to participate in a media conference. You see other people, but you never actually see their certificates. All the certificates that you see are actually presented by the server itself, because you have all hop-by-hop connections with the server, and then the server takes care of relaying the streams around for you. Which means that whenever you are using a server in the middle, you are always losing the end-to-end properties that WebRTC typically guarantees you. You just have security up to the server, and then you don't, basically. Which is what the ITF is trying to work on in the context of the PERC working group, which stands for Private Media Requirements in Privacy Enhanced Conferencing. And basically, the idea is that you, for instance, let's say in the context of an SFU, for instance, like I said, Jitsi, Janus, or MediaSoup or others, you communicate with the component in the middle. The idea is typically to, and I'm oversimplifying this because there are different approaches to this, is to use some kind of a double encryption. So you have a layer of encryption that is used hop by hop exactly as we do now. So I have an SRTP session between me and the server, but then the payload that this SRTP packet contains is itself also encrypted with an end-to-end property. Instead, it is something that is truly end-to-end between me and the people that I'm communicating with. So that you basically have a packet that is encrypted twice. Really, again, really simplifying this, so you may want to have a look at the presentation to have a better idea about this, but this is really the concept. So that even if you don't trust the server cannot do anything with your media, because even if it decrypts the hop-by-hop layer between you and the server, it still has an encrypted packet that it can do anything with, so it cannot record it or stuff like this. And we actually implemented this in Janus a few years ago. I told you I would slip it in at the very end. And you can see some more information in our blog post there. And we also tried to, let's say, use it in more creative ways. So not only for conferencing, but these double encryption properties could actually be used in other contexts as well, like, for instance, broadcasting. So you could, let's say, implement some form of DRM on WebRTC broadcasts by itself, which would be interesting if you find a way to encrypt the content twice, let's say, and even if they manage to establish a pre-connection, they need to get the right key before they can actually decrypt it. which is what we did with a plugin that we have that is called Record and Play. I'm not going through this because it's going to take too much time, but this is something that we have prototyped and this kind of works. And is actually used within the context of an European project that is called Shine. There is not going to be much time to discuss it, but there you can find some more information about this. So I hope that I helped clear the air a bit, and I helped, let's say, make you understand a bit better why WebRTC seems so complex and often is. Hopefully I did a good job at this, so I'm open to questions if there is any time for that.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, we have time. Thanks, Lorenzo. So questions, of course, my first question, and as I walk towards Stefan, when this WebRTC is going to kill this telephony and going to go to retirement?
Okay. I actually have two questions. One is for DTLS RTP between servers. Is there anything that speaks against using real certificates instead of self-signed certificates for the DTLS RTP?
No, I mean, it's just a convenience because basically it's one-shot conversations that just happen with each other. And so typically, considering that these are conversations that can happen with two different browsers and so on, typically you don't have a signed certificate for your own browser or stuff like this. I mean, it makes sense for a browser, for let's say a server to use a verifiable and real certificate, a signed certificate for this. I mean, it makes sense there, even though it's typically not needed for this, even though you can actually also use your custom certificates in a browser itself for actually establishing a communication. Tim may know more about this. I never played with this myself, but there are ways to enforce cryptography and use your own certificates in the browser so that you can, let's say, force this somehow so that you can use a valid certificate there. You use a valid certificate on the server side, and you basically try and force some kind of actual verification on both ends. But the reality is that browsers don't really care at the moment, so they don't really do any validation on the certificates themselves. You may try to enforce it on the server side if you know that you are doing this on the client side yourself, but this is not really available at the moment, which is why they had to come up with that kind of identity provider mechanisms to try and cope with that, so that the identity aspect of this is not mandated at the certificate level by itself, but just by an association with an existing identity that you are known to be associated with and that you can prove somehow via a third-party provider, basically.
Okay. I have one more question is, we are not normally asked to secure phone networks by filtering out all kinds of unwanted things that you would have in your phone network. And then now people come and ask, can you do the same for WebRTC, right? But I mean, what I always say is, okay, we can bridge WebRTC to SIP, and then we can filter out the SIP. But with WebRTC itself, everything that can go through, you can just open the firewall, and you cannot really filter it. Do you know of any approaches to somehow secure or filter the content of WebRTC so that it will not bring everything into your company's network?
Yeah, I mean, this really depends on what you mean by filtering here. In principle, the only things that travel in WebRTC communications are SRTP packets for the media, and then you may have data channels, which are SCTP encapsulated over DTLS, and these messages over there can be whatever you want. It's just a plain connection, like a WebSocket connection over which you can pipe everything. So I'm unsure here what you mean by filtering. So in principle, it's if you make sure that all that the WebRTC endpoint is generating is either SRTP or DTLS, because of course the data channels are going to use that. As long as those two are the only protocols that you are using, and of course STAN for ICE communications and so on, as long as you've enforced that, you are safe and you know that WebRTC will work, because those are the only protocols from that will actually be used on the wire. Not sure if I answered you or if I actually managed to confuse you even more.
Okay.
Okay. Any other question? If yes, on the back, then maybe Stefan can pass the microphone. Otherwise, thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you.